You are using the wrong settings right now. Not metaphorically, literally. The default ringtone on your phone. The pre-selected privacy options in the apps you use every day. The pension contribution rate your employer set when you were hired. The homepage your browser opened when you installed it 6 years ago. You did not choose any of these. Someone else chose them for you, and you accepted the choice by doing nothing. And the most unsettling part is not that defaults are everywhere. It is that you know this, and still, overwhelmingly, you do not change them. This is status quo bias. It is one of the most pervasive cognitive tendencies ever documented by behavioral economists, and it is the engine that drives billions of dollars in corporate profits, kills thousands of people annually who could have lived if paperwork had been designed differently, and keeps democratic citizens locked into financial products they would never knowingly choose. In 1988, two economists, William Samuelson of Boston University and Richard Zeckhauser of Harvard, published a paper that named something that had always existed but had never been formally described. They constructed a series of hypothetical scenarios. In one, a participant was told, "You have inherited a sum of money and must decide how to invest it." Different participants received different versions. Some were given a neutral starting position, while others were told the inheritance was already invested in one of the options, and they could keep it or switch. The results were unambiguous. Participants who were told their inheritance was already in a particular investment were dramatically more likely to keep it there, regardless of which option was listed as the existing holding. The status quo, whatever it happened to be, attracted disproportionate loyalty. In a windowless office at MIT a few years later, a young economist named Richard Thaler was reading their paper and thinking about pension enrollment data. He was thinking about why people who were offered a good pension plan, with employer matching, low fees, long-term growth, failed to enroll. Not because they had considered the plan and rejected it, because enrolling required a form. The default was not enrolled, and not enrolled was the status quo. Thaler would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2017, partly for his work on this insight. But in the late 1980s, he was simply watching people fail to fill out forms that would make them materially richer. The inertia was not rational. It was something deeper, a gravitational pull toward whatever the current state happened to be. In 2003, Eric Johnson and Daniel Goldstein published a study in Science that made the stakes of status quo bias viscerally clear. They examined organ donor registration rates across 11 European countries and found a pattern not explained by culture, healthcare infrastructure, or public awareness campaigns. The gap was not 5 or 10 percentage points. It was the difference between nearly zero and nearly everything. In Denmark, only 4.25% of the population was registered as organ donors. In Germany, 12%. In the Netherlands, 27.5%. Meanwhile, in Austria, 99.98%. In France, 99.91%. In Hungary, 99.97%. The difference was a single design decision on a single government form. In the low donation countries, the form asked citizens to opt in. The default was not a donor. In the high donation countries, you were presumed to be a donor unless you actively opted out. The default was donor. Tens of thousands of people die every year in Europe waiting for organ transplants. The deaths are not caused by a shortage of organs in any absolute sense. They are caused by a checkbox, by the direction of the default, by the asymmetric power of inertia. Citizens in opt-out countries were free to remove themselves from the donor registry at any time. Most never did. Not because they wanted to be donors, because changing the default requires a decision, and decisions require effort, and effort, for most people on most days, is a resource in short supply. In 1991, a company in the American Midwest changed a single feature of its employee benefits enrollment process. Instead of asking new employees to opt in to the 401k retirement savings plan, the company began automatically enrolling all new employees, while retaining the right to opt out. Participation jumped from 49% to 86% within a year. Not because the plan had improved, because the default changed. Brigitte Madrian and Dennis Shea documented this shift in a landmark 2001 paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. The effect held across all salary levels and age cohorts, with particularly strong effects among younger and lower-wage workers, precisely the groups who most needed to be saving. In the United States, where retirement security depends largely on individual savings decisions, the design of the enrollment default was not a bureaucratic detail. It was a determinant of whether millions of Americans would have sufficient income in their 60s and 70s. Congress eventually listened. The Pension Protection Act of 2006 was partly designed to normalize automatic enrollment. By 2018, the majority of large American employers had moved to auto-enrollment defaults. In an apartment in Detroit in 2003, a 24-year-old warehouse worker named Darius received a benefits packet. The 401k form was 8 pages long, required choosing from 17 investment options, and had to be returned within 30 days. The packet sat on his kitchen table for a week, then moved to a drawer. The 30 days passed. Darius did not have a retirement account at 35. In an identical warehouse in Ohio 3 years later, a 24-year-old named Marcus was automatically enrolled at a 3% contribution rate in a diversified target date fund, with the option to adjust or opt out. Marcus did not change anything. He had a retirement account at 35. The difference was not intelligence or discipline. It was the direction of a default. In October 2007, the United States Department of Justice filed a legal brief around an apparently mundane question. Should Microsoft be allowed to set Internet Explorer as the default browser on Windows computers? By 2002, Internet Explorer had approximately 96% of the browser market. Not because it was the best browser, because it was the default on every Windows machine, which ran on 95% of personal computers worldwide. The default was a market position worth billions of dollars. Research found that users who expressed a preference for a different browser in surveys still used Internet Explorer at substantially higher rates because the friction of switching, downloading an alternative, installing it, changing the default, was sufficient to preserve the status quo. The difference between "I should probably switch" and actually switching was a 5-minute download. For most users, that was an insurmountable barrier. Google understood this with crystalline clarity. In 2020, the Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit alleging that Google had illegally maintained its monopoly in search by paying Apple and other manufacturers to make Google the default search engine. Google reportedly paid Apple between $8 and $12 billion per year, not for exclusive rights, for the default, for the inertia. Google's internal analysis indicated that default search positions were worth approximately 12 times more revenue than non-default positions. The default was not a preference. It was a lock. A study at Carnegie Mellon University found that the average Windows user had changed fewer than 5% of their computer's default settings over the lifetime of the machine. Microsoft's own research found that the percentage of users who changed any default setting within the first 30 days was well below 10%. This is not because default settings are optimal. They are designed to be acceptable to the broadest possible audience, which means they are optimal for almost no one. Every default is a compromise, and yet virtually everyone keeps it. The smartphone has compounded this exponentially. The average device ships with dozens of pre-configured settings governing location tracking, app permissions, advertising identifiers, and data sharing. These settings are not neutral. They are designed to maximize data collection and platform revenue. Privacy researchers at the Norwegian Consumer Council documented in 2020 that the default privacy settings on both iOS and Android resulted in personal data being shared with dozens of third-party companies in real time. The design of privacy settings, the number of steps required, the opacity of the language, the location of controls within nested menus, was systematically structured to preserve the data-permissive default. In a suburb of Stockholm, a 43-year-old software engineer named Eric, who codes for a living, who understands how data collection works, has never changed the advertising identifier settings on his phone. He means to. He has thought about it several times. The status quo holds. Netflix's product design is a systematic exercise in converting every possible point of friction into a default that keeps users watching and billing cycles running. Autoplay, the automatic continuation from one episode to the next, was introduced in 2012, opt-out from its inception. It increased average viewing time per session by a significant margin. Users who wanted to stop watching had to actively decide to stop. The default was to continue. The feature shifted the question from, "Do I want to watch another episode?" to, "Do I want to stop watching?" Stopping requires confronting the fact that you are choosing to stop. Continuing requires nothing at all. The broader subscription economy has built itself around this insight. A 2019 study from the University of Chicago found that gym members on auto-renewing contracts paid 17% more per visit than month-to-month members, because they renewed automatically during months they intended to cancel. Subscription box services rely on the transition from free trial to paid subscription. A 2020 analysis found that free trial to paid conversion rates were between 40 and 60% higher for services using automatic enrollment than those requiring explicit re-enrollment. The user who did not cancel became a paying customer by default. In a studio apartment in Austin, a 31-year-old musician named Sophia has 14 active subscriptions. She thought she had 6. 8 she uses rarely or never. 7 she has been meaning to cancel for over a year. The status quo held. In 2008, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein published Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. The book made a radical argument. Because human beings are predictably influenced by default settings, the people who design defaults are making consequential choices about behavior whether they intend to or not. There is no such thing as a neutral default. Thaler and Sunstein coined the term choice architecture, the design of decision environments. A choice architect is anyone who designs a context in which people make decisions. A cafeteria manager deciding which foods to place at eye level. An HR department deciding whether enrollment is opt-in or opt-out. The United Kingdom created the Behavioral Insights Team in 2010, the first government body dedicated to applying behavioral science to policy design. By 2013, the team had documented that changing defaults on organ donor forms, modifying tax compliance letters, and adjusting payment reminders had generated measurable improvements at minimal cost. By 2020, Behavioral insights units existed in more than 200 government bodies worldwide. The insight that defaults are power had moved from academic papers to the machinery of governance. Not all defaults are about money. Some determine whether people live or die. In the United States, do not resuscitate orders are opt-in documents. The default, in the absence of such a document, is full resuscitation, regardless of the patient's age, condition, or previously expressed wishes. Research in the New England Journal of Medicine found that a significant proportion of patients in intensive care who receive aggressive resuscitation in the final stages of terminal illness had previously expressed to family that they did not want such interventions. The conversation had happened. The form had not been filled out. The default ran its course. Among Americans over 65, only about 37% had any advance directive on file, despite surveys showing that over 80% have clear preferences about end-of-life care when asked. The gap between having a preference and having a form is the gap that status quo bias creates. At the opposite end of life, in states where newborn hearing screening is opt-out, screening rates exceed 99%. In jurisdictions where screening is opt-in, rates fall to between 70 and 80%. Children with hearing impairment go unidentified not because their parents opposed screening, but because the default was never set to screen. Credit card companies discovered early that annual fee cards with automatic renewal retained customers who would have canceled if renewal required action. The act of canceling requires calling, navigating phone menus, being transferred to a retention specialist trained in counter-arguments, and enduring a conversation designed to be sufficiently unpleasant that many customers abandon the process. This friction is not accidental. It is engineered. The Federal Trade Commission's 2023 Click to Cancel rulemaking proposed requiring companies to make cancellation as simple as enrollment. It was opposed on the grounds that it would cost companies billions, a precise measure of how much the engineered friction was worth. Telecommunications companies rely on status quo bias more than almost any other industry. Research consistently finds that customer satisfaction with internet providers is among the lowest of any consumer category. Yet churn rates are among the lowest of any subscription industry. The dissatisfied customer who does not leave is the business model. A 2021 Consumer Reports analysis found that American households with cable or broadband were paying significantly more than rates available to new customers from the same provider. The providers raised rates on existing customers gradually, counting on inertia. Customers who called to cancel were offered competitive rates. The customers who did not call subsidized the ones who did. If status quo bias is running large portions of your life, and the evidence strongly suggests it is, what do you do about it? Richard Thaler's insight was that the bias cannot be eliminated. You cannot will yourself into a friction-indifferent decision-maker. The bias is structural. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a design principle. The first step is an audit. Sit down with your bank statements and list every recurring charge. List your subscriptions, insurance providers, utility contracts, your mobile plan. For each, ask, when did I last actively choose this? Is the current arrangement the best available, or simply the one I never got around to changing? Most people who do this carefully find several $100s per year in unnecessary defaults. The second step is understanding which defaults in your institutional life are working for you or against you. Is your employer's retirement plan on auto-enrollment? If not, signing up is one of the highest return actions available. Are your pension contributions going to a sensible fund or to a cash holding that was the path of least resistance at enrollment? Is your organ donor preference registered? Do you have an advance directive? The third step is the structural insight. Design your own defaults deliberately. Automate savings transfers so money moves to savings before you can spend it. Set calendar reminders to review subscriptions annually. Treat the architecture of your own decision environment as something you designed, rather than something that happened to you. The behavioral economist Shlomo Benartzi at UCLA has spent years on Save More Tomorrow programs, pension systems that automatically increase savings rates at each pay raise. Workers enrolled in these programs save significantly more than workers who must actively decide to increase contributions. The genius is simple. It replaces a difficult decision with a better default. In Vienna, the organ donor register is full. In Germany, it is largely empty. The same humans, the same preferences, the same instinct to give, expressed in wildly different rates because a form was designed differently. The architecture of choice is not a footnote to human behavior. It is a primary determinant of it. You are living, right now, inside a set of defaults that someone else designed. Some were designed with your interests in mind. Many were not. The question is not whether you will be subject to defaults. You will be. The question is whether you will ever look at them carefully enough to decide which ones you actually want. Your pension, your phone settings, your internet provider, your organ donor status, your advance directive, your streaming subscriptions, your browser, your insurance, your bank. None of them are permanent. All of them are changeable. All of them are waiting for the decision you have been putting off. The default, until you change it, is that you never